Denny's, the beloved American food chain that now has over 1,700 locations in over 100 countries, has an extensive racist past and present. They continue to be praised for their commitment to addressing and fixing racism within their company, but has it really been addressed if it continues to go on? Hi, hello, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jayda, and today we are going to be doing a deep dive into the racist past and present of the corporation Denny's. In order to understand where Denny's racist roots come from, we're going to be taking a little bit of a detour, and then we'll get back on topic. So we are also going to be discussing the Sambo trope within this video. So this is my first time doing a video like this. Honestly, don't know how it's going to go. If you love it, please make sure to let me know down in the comments. And yeah, let's get into it. So Denny's actually opened in 1953, but it wasn't called Denny's, it was called Danny's Donuts, and it started in Lakewood, California. By 1956, they were expanding a lot because people really loved it. They were really popular, and they had a chain of 6 stores, and they officially changed their name to Denny's in 1961. In 1966, they opened their first location outside of America in Mexico, and they would continue to expand to other countries including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Guam, Puerto Rico, and many, many more. Like I said, they're in over 100 countries as of today. By 1981, they had locations in over 50 states. So they're basically everywhere now. I think they're in every state except for one, if I'm not mistaken. In October of 1982, Denny's actually purchased Sambo's remaining location, and they became a part of the Denny's franchise. It took Denny's years to change the name of these Sambo's restaurants, even though they were now technically a part of the Denny's chain, and it also took them years to get rid of the racist imagery which these Sambo's restaurants had within. While Denny's has continually tried to distance themselves from the racism that the Sambo's chain perpetrated, they haven't done a very good job of doing so, as they continually have racial issues of their own. Let's take it back for a minute and discuss the Sambo Stereotype. To understand why the Sambo's restaurant chain is racist and problematic, we first have to discuss the origins of the racist stereotype and caricature in and of itself. So the term itself, Sambo, derives from a Spanish word zambo, which originated in Latin America and is a term that is used for a person of Black and Indigenous descent. In 1736, Sambo's grave became the burial site of a young slave near the village of Sunderland Point in Lancashire, England. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I hope I'm saying that right. And it's very likely that this boy was of mixed race. The location of this burial site is significant because Sunderland Port was used as a transport hub for cotton, sugar, and enslaved people to and from the West Indies, America, and Canada. What is a Sambo? In Western societies and cultures, it was and is presently used as a derogatory term and stereotype towards Black people, but specifically Black men. It was used as a justification and defense for enslavement and later racial segregation and now currently racism. So it is a racist stereotype which was created by white folks, which portrays Black men, or just Black people in general, as stupid, incompetent, happy-go-lucky, jolly, jovial, naive, subservient, happy to be included, happy to be enslaved, and happy to serve. It was a stereotype that was used to justify slavery, as they were able to insinuate that Black men were happy to be enslaved, that they were enthused to be of service, and they didn't want to live their lives in any other way, which couldn't be further from the truth. But that's what they said. If Black people were happiest when they were enslaved, how could anyone else possibly have an issue with it, was the narrative that they were able to push with this stereotype. Also insinuates that Black people are lazy, easily scared, inarticulate, they are simple-minded, and they are docile. It makes it seem as if they're perpetually childlike or in a childlike state of mind, which means that they're inherently useless as an adult and that they need adults, who would be the white people in this scenario, to guide them throughout life. By the 1900s, the stereotype was typically attached to older Black men who were considered docile, who accepted racism and racial segregation, who didn't want to rock the boat, who wanted things to stay the same and do what was necessary to keep white people happy, even if it was at the expense of themselves and their own well-being and the well-being of other Black people around them. Although the stereotype started as a justification for slavery, as with all racist tropes, it transcended beyond that. It was and still is pervasive in media of all forms, such as music, movies, folk sayings, literature, children's stories and games, postcards, restaurant names and menus, and much more. Not only is the stereotype extremely problematic, but it puts Black people in a box and attempts to coddle and comfort white people in their racism by teaching them that it's justified and that what they're doing and the things that they're perpetuating are okay. One of the first times the Sambo character was formally introduced in media and literature was in Edmund Botsford's story Sambo and Tony, a dialogue in 3 parts, which was released in 1808. Sambo, of course, is the happy slave, and he is chastising his buddy Tony because Tony is complaining about being a slave, saying that their master makes him work too hard. Sambo then replies and tells him that he is being ungrateful. He has a good home, a good job, and food in his belly and clothes on his back, so what are you complaining for? And when I read that, I was just like, oh my god, this reminds me of a lot of things that Black people say to their kids. It goes to show how deeply rooted this concept of having your basic needs met as enough run. But anyways, let me get back on topic. So Tony then is like, yeah, he does all that for us, but he also works us so hard, like telling him, I have a right to complain, like I have a right to be upset. And Sambo then calls him wicked and ungrateful. And Tony's like, what you call wicked, Sambo? Like, in my mind, this is how the conversation went. This is what was written. From this line, the "what you talking about, Willis" phrase from the 1980s sitcoms Different Strokes originated.
What you talking about, Willis?
So again, showing how that idea, that caricature prevails. This stereotype was also seen as legitimate. So not only was it just perpetuated, white people would often do things to add legitimacy to it. So this happened in Bishop Whipple's Southern Diary, which he wrote in 1834 when he was observing Black people in the South. He said, "They seem a happy race of beings, and if you did not know it, you would never imagine that they were slaves. The loud laugh, the clear dancing eye, the cheerful face shows that in this sad world of sin and sorrow, they know very few." So insinuating that because they are slaves, they don't know any troubles, they don't know any hardships, they are good, they are happy, they don't have anything to worry about.
The woman was too stunned to speak.
Okay, so in minstrel shows, the Sambo stereotype was also extremely popular and well-loved by white people, but rose to popularity in the 1830s. This is when the Sambo stereotype officially began to become ingrained in the media portrayal of Black people, specifically targeted at Black men. These minstrels were created with the intention of not only mocking Black people, but also trying to cement their place into society. They were not only meant to know their place, they were also meant to remain in it. And if they stepped out of line, it was up to white people to put them back in their place. So if you don't know what a minstrel show is, it's basically just when white people would dress up and mock Black people, is the simplest way to put it. So the story of Little Black Sambo by Helen Bannerman was published in 1899, and this book centers around a little Black boy in India, but after it got popular, Helen decided to change the setting to be a U.S. plantation in the South. So the book discusses a happy-go-lucky Black boy who loses his clothes to tigers. The book itself is built upon a variety of racist and stereotypical notions about Black people. The more popular the book became, the more racist the imagery became within it. Helen also built her whole career off of writing children's books that were based off of racist stereotypes of Black people, such as the Little Black Mingo, Little Black Quasha, and Little Black Quiba. On February 6th, 1935, Little Black Sambo, the animated film, was released.
Child, but watch out for that bad old tiger. That old tiger sure do like dark meat.
So again, further cementing those racist ideals into the minds of not only adults, but also children. So as they grow up, they continue to see it as truth and just hold it with them for the rest of their lives. The Sambo stereotype, you can see it present in The Green Mile, which was released in 1999, Different Strokes, which was released in 1978, JJ from Good Times, which was released in 1974, and Spinning into Butter, released in 2007. The Little Black Sambo movie was actually referenced in The Green Mile, and clips from the movie was played in the intro of Spinning into Butter. So this one's a little bit more controversial, but in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, is when the character Jar Jar Binks was introduced, and many Black people, and not Black people, they say that it's clear through his method of speech and general demeanor that he was inspired by the Sambo character and trope.
Oh, muy, I love you.
You almost got us killed. Are you brainless?
I speak.
The ability to speak does not make you intelligent. Now get out of here.
No, Mrs. Stay. Missa called Jayda Binks. Missa your humble servant.
That won't be necessary.
Oh, but it is. 'Tis demanded by the gods, it is.
And that them disguising him not being a black person but being a frog doesn't take away from the stereotype that is still attached to him. So in 1957, the Sambo's restaurant chain opened their first location. In 1957, the restaurant chain Sambo's was started by Sam Battistone Sr. and Newell Bonnet in Santa Barbara, California. It was a chain style of family restaurants that offered diner-style table service, and they had a wide menu. The pair claimed that the name was created from a combination of their names, but it was quickly seen that that was some BS. Instead of choosing another name, they decided to lean into the stereotype, the racist stereotype, and their first mascot was a little black boy, and their tagline was "the finest pancakes west of the Congo." They also had a lot of their dishes named after the characters in the book, and notice they opened this restaurant with this name after the movie had released, after the books had received a lot of popularity, a lot of attention. At this point, it's very clear that there's a problem with this stereotype. Like, the NAACP had made it very clear that they were protesting this book and they wanted it to be removed from all schools. So it was clear that this was problematic, but the white people decided to lean into it anyways to make money. Quickly, obviously, the restaurant was associated with not only the Sambo stereotype, but also the story of Little Black Sambo. The founders capitalized on this connection as they realized that they could make a lot of money from it, so they began to decorate all of their restaurants with images and scenes from the book. They even opened a kids club named Sambo's Tiger Tamers to promote the restaurant, specifically the family and the kids aspect. They knew if they marketed to kids using familiar imagery, then they would be able to make a lot of money. So by the 1960s, they had changed some of their images to portray a light-skinned boy wearing a turban. So it's unclear if they made this shift due to backlash or if they wanted to just try a new marketing platform. Now, at this point, they're still obviously being problematic, but just in more ways. So they're still using a variety of cultures in racist ways for their own capital gain, and they're still using this racially derogatory term as a name for their restaurants. So in 1963, they had over 16 locations across America in a bunch of cities. So they were doing well. They were getting popular. They were making money. White people loved this chain, which no surprise there. By 1969, they had over 98 locations and expanded to create additional franchises such as Red Top Hamburgers, Heidi's Pie Shop, and the Blue Ox Steakhouse. From 1972 onwards, they began to receive a lot of public backlash from the Black community. It's very likely that this happened a lot sooner, but it wasn't very well documented, so I couldn't really find it. Like, I believe Black people were protesting from the time this restaurant started to pop up near them, but their voices didn't matter up until this point. Of course, Black people wanted them to change their name due to the racist history that had been targeted towards Black Americans. And they were calling out the racist overtones of the imagery, the menu, the way that they were marketing, but mostly the name. So protests and lawsuits began to mount against the Sambo's chain, but they did not care. They had a lot of money invested, they were capitalizing off of the name and the racism, and they were picking up momentum and popularity, so they refused to change their name. Like, they just were not going to do it. They literally just ignored Black Americans. They're like, we don't care. By 1976, the Sambo's chain was doing approximately $380 million in sales, which is equivalent to $1.6 billion today. In 1977, a very well-loved column writer, William Raspberry, publicly weighed into this whole debacle, and he said that the name Sambo is taken by Black Americans across the land as an insult. It's extremely hard to imagine that the owners did not know this. He also said that it wasn't surprising that the company claimed to have few formal complaints made directly to their headquarters. He went on to say that I am not likely to write a letter of protest if I assume that you are insulting me and you simply don't give a damn. Like, there's no point. Why are you expecting Black people to take the onus to tell you that what you're doing is wrong when you know that what you're doing is wrong? Like, obviously you're not going to listen to them, and William was a real one for that. In response to the mounting pressure, 12 of their over 100 locations that were opening that year were renamed to the Jolly Tiger. So the last of the restaurants that opened under this name was in 1977. But they only did this in communities that had passed resolutions forbidding the use of Sambo's as a chain, or they would refuse to grant them the necessary permits to include that name. So they basically were just like, we are not going to give you the paperwork. We're not going to let you be here unless you change the name. But after they were already established in those areas, they went back to change the names in March of 1979. They publicly stated their intent to rename all of their locations back to Sambo's. They claimed that they had to change the name back because the initial name change resulted in poor financial performance to all of the locations in which it applied. So you're telling me that you're not able to make money off of racism and you're just going to go back to racism because you need money. Cool. And black people are just supposed to be okay with that. Okay, and mind you, all of this is happening before Denny's acquired them as a chain, and all of this happened very publicly. So Denny's knew what they were doing when they would go on to purchase the Sambo's chain. Sambo's headquarters in 1979, when they said that they were going to go back to the Sambo's name in all of the restaurants, they said that black people didn't own the name and pulled the "I have a black friend" card by stating that 3 times as many black people ate at Sambo's than any other full-service restaurant, which, how do you know that? How do you know that? Are you counting the amount of black people that come into that doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even make sense. I find it extremely hard to believe that black people are willingly going to this chain while knowing the name and the racist history. I do not believe that at all. Everything they did pandered to white people, was marketed to white people. So I don't believe this. I believe that they, like I said, I have a black friend card. They pulled that just to shut down anyone accusing them of racism. By this point, it was also very clear that the black people who did go to Sambo's were consistently mistreated. In 1979, the Sambo's chain peaked with over 1,100 locations in 47 states. By March of 1981, they attempted to try and give the chain a new image, and they renamed a couple of the locations No Place Like Sam's due to a decrease in profits. So after they were like, yeah, we're not changing the name, we're not changing anything, they were boycotted by the black community and other communities in solidarity with the black community. So they figured if they could change a few things around, that they would be able to get their support back and keep their money up to where it used to be. Like I said before, they were pulling in over $1.6 billion a year. So they're like, we need that. We need that back. However, their little marketing ploy didn't work at all. People were just done with them at this point. They're like, we've given you enough chances, we've given you enough grace, we're just over it. Other restaurants were popping up that were not racist, so they would rather go and spend their money there. In November of 1981, the Sambo's chain and the companies affiliated and associated with them went bankrupt.
That's on period!
And that's on karma. So they ultimately cited that it was corporate level decisions that led to the company's demise. So they were blaming it on corporate, saying that corporate was trying to give too much money away. They were trying to give too much money to managers. The pay was too high, just all of those things. So they blamed it on corporate. But ultimately, you and I, we know that they lost money because people were boycotting the restaurant due to the racist history, the racist imagery, the racist name, and just overall racism and prejudice that was wrapped up in this restaurant and in the name. By 1982, they filed for bankruptcy protection and sold all but one of their remaining locations to Denny's. Denny's allowed the locations to continue running with the name and imagery as Sambo's for years, thus perpetuating the racism themselves. And like I said, all of the racist past, everything that went on up until this point, Denny's knew about, and they still made the decision to purchase the Sambo's chain and keep the name and the images and everything the same for a couple years. In 2020, the last Sambo's restaurant actually changed its name. It was owned by Chad Stevens, who is a grandson of one of the original owners, but this name change only came forth after a petition, and again, a lot of public pressure was put on Chad to change the name in May of 2020. So in June of 2020, the original front sign was changed to their motto, which was peace and love, before changing the name to Chad's Cafe. But they did decide to keep the same signage. So the sign that previously said Sambo's and it was black with white letters, it now said Chad's, but it was white with black letters. So, yeah. Okay, back to Denny's. So like I mentioned a couple times now, Denny's purchased a bunch of Sambo restaurants, but it would take a few years for them to convert the remaining Sambo's locations into Denny's, but they only did so after receiving a lot of backlash due to the racist origins of the restaurant and the chain name. So it was also highlighted during this time when people were calling them out for keeping Sambo's as Sambo's. So despite being in operation for about 50 years, Denny's did not have a single franchise that was opened and operated by a black person. So this was a problem. While Denny's has tried to distance themselves from the racism that the Sambo's chain perpetuated, they haven't done a very good job of doing so, as they have continually had racial issues of their own. So we're going to get into those. In 1994, Denny's agreed to pay out black customers over $56 million to settle a number of lawsuits that had been filed under the basis of racial discrimination. There were over 4,000 claims that black people had formally filed stating that they had been refused service, they'd been called racial slurs by employees, their restaurants had been upholding racial segregation despite it being outlawed, that black customers were forced to pay more than white customers, they were forced to prepay, and they were forced to pay cover charges to eat at a restaurant, and they were overall just being treated worse than white people when they were working there and when they were attending as customers. The fact that it was 4,000 people shows that it was not a random occurrence. It wasn't just a one-off employee or someone going rogue. This was a pervasive attitude of discrimination that was consistent amongst management at all levels and then trickled down to the employees. When the lawsuits were initially filed and announced, previous management came forth and made it clear that the racism came from the highest level and down. During training sessions, management was told how to deal with what was considered too many blacks in a restaurant at one time. They were to call it a blackout and do what they could to reduce the amount of black people who would be in the restaurant. Denny's employees across the board had been trained that women and minorities, specifically black people, paid less, tipped less, or didn't pay at all. As a result, they were taught it was fine to take longer to seat black folks, seat them at dirty or inadequate tables, or just not seat them at all. The company denied that they had discriminatory policy, but it's very clear that the executives only made the call to publicly say this because they did not want to discourage black people who made up 10% of the chain's customers from eating there. Again, I don't understand how they're getting these statistics. I don't understand why they were keeping track of this. And it's giving, I have a black friend energy, so the same thing that the Sambo's chain tried to do. At the time, this was the largest and the broadest settlement under the federal public accommodations laws, which were adopted 30 years prior to end segregation in restaurants and other places that were serving the public. The class action federal lawsuit had been filed on behalf of thousands of black customers whom Denny's had violated their civil rights in basically every state in which they had locations. And a lot of these locations where these incidences happened had been obtained through the Sambo's purchase. So some of the cases that were brought forth in the class action suit were from Christina Ridgway, who attended a Denny's location in San Jose in 1991. She was 17 years old when she went into the restaurant with a bunch of her other teenage friends as they were attending a college forum sponsored by the San Jose NAACP. So how ironic is it that they're attending a conference for the NAACP and they're experiencing racism in the area? The restaurant manager demanded a cover charge from Christina in addition to prepayment for her meal, while the white counterparts that she was with didn't have to do this at all. She was singled out. Also in 1991, Rachel Thompson went to a Denny's on her birthday. Everyone knows that on your birthday, Denny's has a promotion which means that you get a free meal. Rachel went out of her way to bring her baptism certificate in order to prove that it was her birthday, but Denny's employees refused to take it as valid proof. They then accused her and her family very publicly, very loudly of being criminals and thieves, and made them leave. In another one of these instances, a black federal judge from Houston, Texas, was forced to wait over an hour to be served at a Denny's in California. While he and his wife were waiting to be seated, they were taunted by white customers who called them racial slurs, while white people walked in behind them and were seated ahead of them, no problem, and white employees saw the way that these black people were being treated by the white customers and did nothing about it. In South Carolina, for over 3 years, there were a bunch of complaints filed by black patrons who were facing racial segregation. They were required to prepay or make additional payments that were not required of their white patrons. In 1993, the incident that was thought to have brought forth this federal lawsuit, which is it makes me annoyed because it's like this was what made them see it as valid, but there was a group of Secret Service agents who were working for President Clinton, I believe it was at the time, and they went to a Denny's. They went to the Denny's with their white coworkers, and when they got to the restaurant, they were split up by racial groups. The black people were made to stand behind and wait. They were made to also prepay for their food and again wait, even though they got there at the same time. By the time their white coworkers had been seated, finished eating, and were paying is when the black coworkers had just been seated. As a result of those incidences that I mentioned, and a lot more, those are just the ones that stood out the most to me, they had to pay out, like I said, over $50 million. But in July of 1994, they also reached an agreement with the NAACP to spend at least $1 billion in jobs and contracts for minority groups over the next 7 years. Now, when they say minority groups, I'm not sure if they meant minority groups or if they just said that because they didn't want to say black people, but this was supposed to be prioritizing black people as the main targets of their racism had been black people. In 1994, they also hired James B. Admonson to tighten up the discrimination on all levels. He said that he tried to make it clear that if anyone was caught participating in any type of discriminatory act, they were to be immediately fired, regardless of what their position was. When he got into this position, he immediately fired a bunch of managers and intentionally replaced them with women and black people and other minorities who were fit for the job. He also did so with a bunch of board members in an effort to create a more diverse and tolerant environment in all positions. So he figured that if he could go in and change things by adding in more minorities, then things would change. But you can't just add minorities into a racist space and expect things to shift. The culture has to change. It's not going to change just because you add black people in there. But James also said that if anyone carried out the old practices that they were previously trained in, they were to be met with some kind of consequence, whether it was being fired or a write-up or something along those lines. But this obviously wasn't anything but a front and a farce because the discrimination just continued. On April 11th, 1997, a group of 6 Asian and 1 white Syracuse students went to Denny's. They went to the restaurant together and attempted to be seated in the middle of what the managers called an early morning bar rush. They were made to wait, and the white people who came in after them were consistently being seated before them. So there was tables and seating available, they just didn't serve them because it was a group of Asian people. So the white student who was with them, Derek Lizardo, spoke up and questioned the hostess about why this was going on. He could clearly see what was going on, and he didn't want his Asian friends to have to take the brunt of this. So he stood up and said something. All Derek did was ask what was going on, and the hostess named Melissa Kurtz had him escorted out of the restaurant by 2 off-duty deputies who were acting as security guards for the restaurant, as it was late at night. So after this happened, the rest of the group didn't say anything to anybody. They just went outside with their friend, so they left the restaurant. Then, they were all approached by a group of white men who were previously inside of the Denny's restaurant, watched the whole altercation took place, then left the restaurant to perpetuate racism at this group of individuals even further. A fight broke out amongst the groups at around 2:50 a.m. Me personally, I wouldn't call it a fight because Derek and his group of friends were caught completely off guard. They were attacked by these racist white men who sat in the restaurant, heard everything go down, and then knew that they'd be able to go outside and fight them because nobody cared. Derek and his group of friends were hoping that someone would step in and help them, step in and protect them, and that did not happen. 2 of the Asian students were knocked unconscious in the fight. Others had cuts, bruises, and scratches, and they were pretty badly injured. Just want to note, I'm just saying the Asian students because where I was looking, their names weren't publicized, and I imagine that this was for their own safety. The security guards who had escorted them out of the building watched the fight from inside as it happened and did nothing about it, which makes me think that they might have put the battery in these boys' backs to go outside and start an altercation, to start a fight. 2 black students, Anthony Pons and Marshall Wolfel, were watching from the waiting area and noticed that the guards were also watching and didn't attempt to intervene, so they went outside themselves to break up the fight. And when they went back inside to voice their concerns to the employees, they were given a warning to basically drop it, stop talking about the situation, and when they refused, they were told to leave. Police had only shown up after the white folks had left the incident, so it was just the group of beaten up people, minorities, in the parking lot, just kind of standing there. The police then proceeded to brush off the incident by saying that it was a drunken parking lot fight that had gotten out of hand. Yet they didn't do any breathalyzer test or sobriety test. They dismissed basically everything the minority students said happened. They went inside, talked to the racist white folks, and took their word for it, saying that it was just a drunken altercation and everyone just needed to go home, basically. There was nothing that they could do, nor was there anything that they cared to do. In August of 1997, the students filed a lawsuit against Denny's, their parent company, and the police, which brought forth 20 causes for action. They also accused Syracuse police and court officials of not investigating the events properly or adequately due to racism, and they stated that Denny's had violated their civil rights. But the case would only go on to be dropped by a judge because the judge said that they couldn't prove that their civil rights had been violated. The students then decided to appeal the decision, and the case was dropped once again. In 2012, two black diners, Renee Herbert and Henry Williams, were at an LA Denny's location on Vermont Avenue, and they were asked to prepay for their meals, whereas white diners were not. When the issue went public, the manager denied the claim, but later retracted that claim when video footage resurfaced. It's clear that the couple was made to prepay, and the manager then tried to retract that he made them prepay and apologize after being called out by other non-black customers. He then tried to return to them the $80 that he demanded before they were able to be seated and eat. He then kept going back to the table by trying to apologize and offer complimentary desserts for his racism. But this just shows that he was heavily monitoring them even after he had been called out for his racist actions, and he was watching them under the guise of good customer service. They denied the complimentary desserts and even boxed up their food and left before they finished eating because of how uncomfortable they were.
Even after they had packed up and they were getting ready to leave, the racism continued as the manager insisted on following them all the way out, making sure that they paid, and then following them outside of the store, monitoring them.
Bradley Sachs, the man who had confronted the manager about his actions and watched everything go down, he said that he was appalled, and so he went and approached them, gave them his name and his phone number, and told them that the discrimination that they faced was terrible. He also told them that he wouldn't have been as calm as they were if someone had done something like that to them. Bradley also went on to tell media that he was there a couple times after this incident had happened, and he had consistently seen the manager make black patrons prepay. The couple filed a lawsuit in 2014 on the basis of racial discrimination, and in 2016, the case was dismissed.
Denny's has settled a lawsuit with a black couple who say they were discriminated against when they were asked to pay for their food in advance. Appear to be keeping the terms of the settlement confidential.
I also feel like Bradley's comments are important to talk about just a little bit because there's this expectation that black people are to be treated terribly and react to it with a smile on their face, very much like the Sambo character, that Sambo trope where horrible things are being done to you, but you're still happy to be there, you're happy to be included, you're happy to be present. So anything that any person says or does to you, you're just supposed to take it and just be like, yeah, it's cool, and move on. So now I'm going to talk about two Canadian cases of recent racism from Denny's, and I felt like it was important to talk about the Canadian cases because I feel like people often see Canada and America as two different entities. They don't really see them as one and the same when it comes to racism and prejudice and the things that they perpetuate and the way that they act, the way that they treat Black people, Indigenous people, minority groups just in general. So I thought it was important to highlight these cases to show and remind people that, like, Canada, just as bad as America. We just don't have as many people, but just as bad, just as evil, just as racist. So in 2017 in Vancouver, Helena Moses, a First Nation woman, and her boyfriend, who's also Indigenous, who lived in the Yukon, were visiting Vancouver. After a fun night out, the pair went to get some food at around 4 a.m., as one usually does after you've gone out and you've had a good night. Like, I think the only time I've been to a Denny's was, I believe I was 19, and I went there again, it was like 5 a.m. because they're usually open 24 hours. Anyways, they went to a Denny's on Davie Street. They were seated, they ordered some food and some drinks, and about 5 minutes later, the server returned to them and said, "We cannot place your order at the kitchen unless you pay for your food first. The chef won't cook it." Helena then responded and said that it was unfair, and so they refused to prepay. She then stood up and asked the other patrons if they had been forced to prepay, and they said no. They all told her that the server was being unfair and unreasonable. Now, mind you, they were the only Indigenous people, the only minority folks in the restaurant at this time. So a white man had actually stood up for them. He was getting very irritated, very irate at the clear racial discrimination that was being done to the couple. He raised his voice and, like I said, got upset with them for racially profiling these people and adhering to the same practices which Denny had claimed they had gotten rid of over 20 years ago. Helena said in an interview with CBC that she felt as if Denny's staff was assuming that they were going to dine and dash, that they were not going to pay, that they did not have the money to pay simply because they're Indigenous. She felt degraded, she felt upset and embarrassed, so she stood up and left the restaurant. Her boyfriend and the man and the family of the man that had stood up for them were also kicked out. Denny's employees then called the police on the couple and told the police that Helena and Moses were armed and dangerous. What? So luckily there were a bunch of white witnesses to stand up for them, otherwise that situation could have ended a lot differently. Police determined that they did not do anything wrong and they went on their way. So not only did they try and make them prepay, they also were using white privilege to try and weaponize the police on these indigenous people for doing nothing but being indigenous and existing. Helena went on to file a formal complaint for discrimination with the BC Human Rights Tribunal, and in 2019, a week before their case was meant to be heard by the tribunal, Denny settled. As if it went to tribunal, it would then become public record, and they did not want that, right? Because then it would tie them back again to the racist history that had been going on since the conception of the brand and since they decided to purchase the Sambo's chain. They went on to settle for an undisclosed amount and they issued a public apology. Helena also demanded that in this settlement, the location receive anti-racism classes, which Denny's agreed to, but it's unclear if they actually adhered to it. So in 2018, April of 2018 specifically,
Munir Omarzai
and his friends went out to a Denny's in Lethbridge, Alberta. So again, kind of late at night, early morning, depending on how you're looking at it, and he and his friends are all visible minorities. They were sat near a white woman named Kelly Pocha. This white woman was clearly uncomfortable to be sat near them. She was glaring at them the minute they sat down, and when one of the men asked if she was okay because they noticed that she was glaring and staring at them pretty heavily, she went on to go on a racist tirade. She was threatening violence. She was trying to climb over the booth to get to them and attack them, and was making a wide array of racist comments.
Go back to your fucking country. We don't need you here.
Why are you being so racist? Why are you being so
all of a
racist?
sudden I'm being racist.
The men then went on to defend themselves, and Kelly said things like, "You are dealing with a Canadian woman right now, and I will leap across this table and punch you right in your fucking mouth." She then told the men to go back to their country, that they're not Canadian.
Relax. It doesn't matter. We're all Canadians.
No, you're not Canadian.
Yes, we
But
are.
you guys need to go back to where you came. I was born and raised here.
We were.
You fucking were.
And she also told them to speak English if they were going to speak as they're in Canada, and that's what we speak in Canada.
Speak English if you're going to speak.
Doesn't matter. I can speak my
Speak
language. It's a
English.
fucking free country.
Speak
Nobody
English.
says
Canada.
Which, no. That's what we speak because Canada was colonized. That's not what Indigenous people spoke. Let's get that clear. We're on stolen land. English is not the native language to Canada. Let's get that clear, Kelly. This video attack would go viral. While Denny's employees were not directly involved in the attack, no one did anything to stop Kelly from acting a hot racist mess in front of everybody. No one did anything to defend the group of men from the racial attacks, the slurs that were being thrown their way. And eventually, the restaurant called the police and asked the men who were attacked to leave the restaurant just as they got their food. Denny's then went and made a public statement stating that everybody followed protocol in this situation and they had only contacted law enforcement because they couldn't de-escalate the altercation. It could have been de-escalated if y'all made her leave. That would have stopped everything right there. Why did you make the men who were being attacked leave? That doesn't make any sense. So after the attack went viral, people found out where Kelly worked and they sent the video to her boss. Did what needed to be done when someone is clearly racist. She was initially fired from her job from Cranbrook Dodge. They issued a public statement, and a part of it said that they strive to be a welcoming and inclusive company with no room for hate or intolerance. They made it clear that they were disturbed by the video and that Kelly's values do not reflect their own, so they got rid of her. But they went on to rehire her only a month or so later after the hype had died down around the video. So now we're going to wrap up by talking about the two most recent cases of discrimination that have been made very public, and these occurred in America. So in October of 2020, a group of Black customers who were attending a Denny's in Philadelphia faced racial discrimination by employees. There were only 2 tables occupied at the time that they entered the restaurant, so it was basically empty. When a group of 4 Black men entered, they were made to wait about 15 minutes to be seated. Like I said, even though the restaurant was completely empty. 2 white men walked in right after them and they did not have to wait. They were sat immediately and their orders were taken immediately. After this was done, the black men were seated, but then the waitress demanded that they pay in advance, saying that the cook would not prepare the food unless they did so. Those were manager's orders. No one else had to do this, so they asked to see the manager, and the manager enforced this. A white couple, Palmer and Esther Pelham, watched all of this go down, and as they asked for their bill, they confronted the waitress about her racist behavior and told her that she was clearly in the wrong, and this shouldn't be happening in 2020. Denny's then went on to make another public statement stating that they have zero tolerance for discrimination.
You lying? Why you always lying?
And so they did a quick investigation and fired the employees who were involved. On November 1st of 2022, Denny's and their franchisor were sued by RWDT Foods Incorporated, which is co-owned by former NFL player Donnell Thompson, for breach of contract, which was rooted in discrimination. Donnell's company became a franchisee of 2 Denny's locations in 2012. They closed these 2 locations 9 days after the lawsuit was filed. His lawyer stated that he was made to jump through hoops which were not required of non-black counterparts to obtain and keep the franchises. Denny's also made him the poster child. They put him up as a prop and a token, as a shield to deflect from their racist past and present. So in 2021, after they had used him and they didn't really want him to be a franchise owner anymore, they tried to terminate the contract due to what they alleged to be a failure to meet training requirements prior to the 2012 opening. It's worth noting that prior to them moving to terminate the contract, Donnell and his company attempted to correct the mistake after it was brought to their attention that was not brought up for almost 10 years. But Denny said, no, we're just going to terminate the contract and you're out. We don't want you anymore. So Denny's has an extensive racist past and present. Racism is obviously pervasive from the top down, as the black man who owned the franchise is even facing discrimination. Even though he has the money and has been operating these Denny's locations successfully since 2012, they didn't want him anymore. They're like, oh, we're sick of you. You go. Them acquiring the Sambo's locations and the Sambo's restaurants just shows that they did not care about the racism. Because if you really truly cared, then you're not going to purchase a chain and keep it as that chain for years that is operating under a racist name with racist imagery and is continually discriminating against their clients. Also, it's worth noting that only after the acquisition happened with Sambo's did the cases of racism perpetuated at the Denny's locations came forward. So it's not a coincidence. And Denny's is often uplifted and upheld and praised for being a company that took the necessary steps to face racial discrimination head on and address racism head on within the company. But obviously they did not do that. They did it for attention, for clout, and for praise that they don't deserve, because the racism is still ongoing. Thank you for watching this deep dive into Denny's racist past and present, also learning a little bit about the Sambo's chain, about the Sambo trope and the problems with it. And I hope to see you in the next video. If you liked this video, then make sure to like this video and subscribe and hit that little bell button so you will be notified every single time I upload a new video. Aside from videos like this, I also have a podcast called Girl You Haven't Heard, where I discuss true crime and Black Canadian history from a critical decolonial perspective. So if that is up your alley, then make sure to subscribe, because those videos come regularly. So again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. A very well-loved columnist, I don't know how to say that word, of the Denny's franchise. And they became a part of the Denny's franchise. Why am I saying franchise like french fries?